Aloha mai kako, you are watching Hawaii Political Reporter.
Aloha and welcome to Hawaii Political Reporter. Thanks for watching. Tonight, part 4 of local boy and sportsman Pat Pacheco on Hawaii government, guns, and the assault rifle ban. But first, part 3 of an extremely important video that you need to watch. The grossly corrupt, unfair, and un-American methods the two monopoly parties have used to duopolize their power at the people's expense. How the DemoPublicans have rigged the system against the people.
And then, of course, there's all kinds of side effects in terms of whether or not you are considered, whether you've committed fraud because Jim instead of James signed, and all of those kinds of little barriers that add up into the collective that it's very rare that you get a candidate who is even able to put his or her name on all 50 ballots. In addition to that, you have a hostile media confronting you. In the case of Ralph's campaign in 2000, there were 3 or 4 New York Times editorials that basically said that he and Pat Buchanan should not even be in the picture. They were, quote, cluttering the field. Just think about that. Since when is political competition cluttering the field? That is the disdain with which the mainstream media looks upon independents and third-party candidates. It's very difficult to get a story. When you do get a story, it's generally about the horse race. How will you affect the chances of one of the two major parties? Not what is it, why is it that you're taking on this incredible burden and you want to talk to the American people and have a dialogue? And what is it that you're proposing? It's very rare to get a substantive story on the issues. It's more, how are you going to affect so-and-so's chances? Well, they never asked the Republican candidate, how are you going to affect the Democrats' chances? Yeah, that's a ridiculous question. So why is it posed all the time as the starting opening question for third-party and independent candidates? Media is incredibly hostile, in part because we grow up in a culture of thinking that somehow we have enshrined a two-party system when the word party is not even in the Constitution. And then, of course, the media is a big racket, and so a lot of campaign money actually goes because we don't provide free airtime, even though the airwaves belong to the Commonwealth to candidates. A lot of the campaign money has to go to buying spots, and some of those spots would cost as much as the salary of people I work with for a few minutes, just because it's so expensive to break into the media market. And then finally, if you want to produce your own media, like we did in 2000, then we had the pleasure of being sued because we exercised our free speech rights to parody MasterCard for copyright and trademark infringement, and then had to battle that as well. So in addition to the media, the ballot access, the regulatory scheme, there's also, as Jim alluded to, the Commission on Presidential Debates. It's a very official sounding name, but it's really a private corporation that sits on New Hampshire Avenue and acts as a cartel in terms of which candidates get to reach tens of millions of people each year in order to be able, or each presidential election, in order to be able to put their points to tens of millions of people in watching in any kind of logical fashion. What they do is they take an average of 15. You have to reach 15% in the average of 5 polls in order to be considered qualified, because they made a very bad mistake in 1992. They actually let Ross Perot in the debates, and so they never wanted to repeat that. And as a consequence, you haven't seen a third party or independent candidate in the presidential debates. And so Ralph Nader could have gone to every stadium as he did, like the Fleet Center and or Madison Square Garden, and filled 20,000 people, and you'd never reach even a fraction of the proportion that you would reach on television, of course, with the imprimatur of these are the serious candidates that should be allowed to have a voice in the election. Finally, I want to point out that there is these are the practical problems, but these are really the answer and the solution to these are fundamentally structural. We have a lot of Band-Aid discussion, is what I would call what's going on now about election perfection, and there's a reason for that. So in 2000, people perceived, I believe wrongly, that because Ralph Nader received 97,000 votes in Florida and the margin of difference between Al Gore and George Bush was 537 votes, that it was somehow all Mr. Nader's fault that we ended up with George W. Bush. What I'd like to point out is that there were other minor party candidates, in fact 8 on the ballot, and all of them received more than 537 votes. That's not difficult. Of course, there were a number of other factors like Catherine Harris, how we purge voter election rolls, the Florida Supreme Court, the intervention of the United States Supreme Court, and but what happened at the end of the day is it became some kind of a national meme that third parties or independents are quote-unquote spoilers. But it's really, really hard to spoil an already spoiled system. And these are, and it's spoiled because of the structural problems, but what engendered was that one of the 2 major parties, you can guess which one, the Democratic Party, in 2004 made it its mission to make sure that Ralph Nader would not get on the ballot and brought 24 lawsuits in the period of 12 weeks to try to stifle competition at the Democratic Party or its allies on the ground in a number of states. And so I don't know how many of people here have been sued. Anybody here ever been sued? Yeah, okay, very rare. Well, imagine getting 24 lawsuits in the period of 12 weeks before you had your cup of coffee. Ralph would start opening up debates, you know, waving a service of summons, saying, this is what democracy looks like. Now, that kind of systemic oppression to try to exclude third-party and independent candidates is something we just should never tolerate in this country. I think fundamentally all of the talk that it was created from the 537 vote difference in Florida. A lot of people, the good thing was that people started paying attention to what was going on in their boards of elections. They started thinking about how do we register people to vote? Why is it that we have an opt-in system? Why is it that the local voter rolls don't match the ones in the state capitals? Why is it that there's chaos and everything is done at the last minute to enter new registered voters? Why don't we have same-day registration? What is this system and who's paying attention? Why don't we have uniform standards of what counts as a vote? Isn't it ridiculous we have to be holding up punch cards to the light and seeing if it has 2 hanging chad or 3 or dimpled or pregnant or whatever? And it was really almost a mockery of our system of governance that people looked at all around the world and said, what are they doing there in the United States? How come they can't determine what's a vote? How come they can't determine who's registered to vote? How come they can't determine what grounds constitute proper grounds for an audit or a recount? How come the machines don't work? What is this? Why are we just asking these questions in the 21st century here in our country? But all that election perfection still won't give you an open and equal competition if you don't have some reform to the systemic barriers to third-party and independent candidates. I'm going to stop now so that we can save more time for questions, but I hope you'll ask some. Thank you.
Now that you've heard her, remember it's Grand Illusion by Teresa Amato, available at your bookstore or online, and Not Invited to the Party by James Bennett, which will be available also in both places. Our final commentator today will be Hans A. von Spakovsky, who is Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, where he manages the Civil Justice Reform Initiative. In addition, von Spakovsky studies the legal aspects of elections, including campaign finance, voter fraud, and voter identification laws, and issues arising from registration and equipment. Before joining Heritage in 2008, Hans served for 2 years as a member of the Federal Election Commission. Previously, he worked at the Justice Department as the counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. He provided expertise and advice on enforcing the Voting Rights Act and the Help America Vote Act of 2002. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Weekly Standard, National Review, and Human Events, among others. He has testified before state and congressional committees and has made presentations to organizations such as the National Association of Secretaries of State, the Federalist Society, the National Council of State Legislatures, and the American Legislative Exchange Council. Hans took a law degree at Vanderbilt University. He received his bachelor's in political science from MIT. Please welcome Hans von Spakovsky.
So I am a lawyer, but I didn't go to Harvard. Does that give me some points? And we used to refer to Harvard when I was at MIT as the little red schoolhouse down the road. I have to say I agree with a lot of things that were said here this morning, particularly when Teresa was talking about how horrible the Federal Election Campaign Act is and how confusing it is and how difficult it makes it for an ordinary person to run for office. In his new book, Professor Bennett outlines many of these problems. He also talks about many of the restrictions on third parties caused by very difficult ballot access laws implemented by the states. He also complains about the federal public funding program, which, as most of you know, was put in place about 30 years ago, and points out the problems with those states like Wisconsin that have put in state versions of public funding for state legislative candidates. Those public funding programs have not achieved any of the supposed purposes that so-called campaign reformers have used to push them. In fact, even under public funding laws, challengers have a harder time knocking off incumbents than I think under a private system. I want to skip to the end of Professor Bennett's book by saying that I agree with many of his conclusions. For example, I agree that restrictive ballot access laws should be relaxed as a matter of fundamental fairness and in the interest of democracy, or in our case, republicanism, since we are a republic and not a democracy in the strictest sense of the word. I believe in competition, something John talked about, and I particularly believe in competition in the political arena. I also think the same thing about anti-fusion laws, and also that the campaign finance law that we have on the federal level also needs to be radically changed. However, I have arguments with some of the things that he says in the book. I mean, for example, you know, the idea that doing all this is going to lead to some sort of renaissance in the American polity or provide a surge of new ideas or policies that are discussed, debated throughout the political world is, I think, an overly optimistic assumption. I also fundamentally disagree with the constant theme expressed throughout the book that there's no difference between the two major parties, that they're simply two sides of the same coin. That would come as quite a surprise to many of the legislators in Congress on the Republican side of the political aisle, who right now and for the last couple of months have been waging quite a fight to try and stop the nationalization of our health care system and the destruction of our economy by the cap and tax system of environmental extremism that's being vigorously pushed by the president and his political party. I think those two issues alone illustrate some very stark differences in the public policy viewpoints of the Republican and Democratic parties, and I find it difficult to agree with the claim that the two parties are bereft of ideas and are simply vehicles that individuals use to achieve political power. There's no doubt there are people in both parties that are like that. But I think that's true of all political parties. But there are also many individual members and candidates in those two parties and in the other independent parties who have fundamentally different outlooks on our Constitution, our governments, and our social and economic policies. And I think it's a denial of reality to claim otherwise. Now, critics of my point of view are going to point to some members of the Republican Party, like the two senators from Maine, who far too often vote with the other major party. But there's no party anywhere, and that includes the independent parties, talked about in Professor Bennett's book, like the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, whose members agree 100% of the time on all issues, or who never agree with the views on certain issues of members of the other two major political parties. As I said, I also agree with Professor Bennett's description of the Federal Election Campaign Act and the amendments to it embodied in the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, also known as McCain-Feingold, which I had the misfortune to have to try to enforce when I was on the FEC. Now, I've expressed my opinion on this on more than one occasion. I got into big trouble at one of my first hearings that we had when I was on the FEC when I said to a lawyer who was there from Democracy 21, which is one of the big campaign reform organizations, when I compared the passage of the McCain-Feingold law to the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. And in fact, the fact that I had said that at a hearing was cited against me publicly in the nomination fight I had trying to get onto the FEC. As Dr. Bennett has pointed out, I think the Supreme Court made a fundamental error when it upheld the main parts of the FECA law in the Buckley versus Vallejo decision. And I got to tell you, having been a commissioner for 2 years at the FEC, I think it's a terrible idea to have a federal bureaucracy making decisions on what kind of political activity and what kind of political speech is acceptable or not acceptable under the force of federal law. I think the FECA law has protected incumbents and made it very difficult for ordinary citizens to run for office, as I've said, because it is a Byzantine and confusing law, and even the 6 commissioners who run it often disagree, doing their best as lawyers to try to figure out what the law prohibits and what it doesn't. I also think that the McCain-Feingold law is directly responsible for the huge growth of 527 and other organizations like that, because what it did in 2002 is it imposed a lot of restrictions on the political parties, the money they can get, and the activities they can engage in. And while you may not like particular political parties, there's a lot more responsibility. You know, if you don't like the particular ads that a political party is running, well, there's things you can do. You know, you cannot give money to that political party. You can work against its candidates. It's hard to do that with a 527 organization. I do think, however, that Dr. Bennett makes a mistake in his book because he makes some sweeping generalizations about this area of the law that do a disservice to a lot of very principled individuals that I've actually met and worked with in Washington. You know, he refers to all the commissioners who've served on the FEC as political hacks who only vote the way their political party wants them to. I can tell you that's false. I mean, I know most of the Republican commissioners who served on the FEC, including Bradley Smith, who I replaced, and in fact, Dr. Bennett quotes Bradley Smith in his book. Look, FECA is a bad law, but all the commissioners that I knew there did their best to try to enforce that law because they had taken an oath when they became commissioners to uphold the law. The claim that all of the votes that they make on the commission are party line votes is also demonstrably false. If you take a look at the history of voting on the FEC since the agency first came in 30 years ago, you will find that in enforcement cases, so these are cases where they're deciding whether someone has violated the law, the number of split votes, remember it's a 6-member commission, there's 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats on there, the number of split votes where they can't make a decision is less than 1% of all cases. In fact, most of the cases are unanimous. So in terms of enforcing the law on a nonpartisan basis, whether the person in front of them is a Democrat, a Republican, a Libertarian, they don't vote on a party line basis, and the history of the FEC shows that. Now, where the split votes have occurred, and there were split votes when I was there, it has invariably been in areas of policy, new regulations, in areas where the law is ambiguous and unclear. And I can tell you that I and the other Republican commissioners I knew, whenever there was a place where we could actually vote a less restrictive view of the law, that was the vote we took. And what you saw and what I saw was there wasn't so much a party breakdown based on party lines and party loyalty, but it was just the fact that most of the Republican commissioners, there were exceptions, were less regulatory minded in the political area, and most of the Democratic commissioners were more regulatory minded in that area. I'll give you one more fact that I think demonstrates that the Republican commissioners don't like the FECA law and are not part of some kind of conspiracy to keep this law in place to try to keep the independent parties and other parties out of it. I recently, along with 7 other former Republican commissioners who represent almost every Republican commissioner that served on it, we recently filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court in the Citizens United case, which, as many of you may know, is a case trying to get parts of the McCain-Feingold law declared unconstitutional as a violation of the First Amendment. We didn't file on the side of the FEC and the law. We all filed on the side of Citizens United, trying to convince the court that with our long experience, 75 years worth combined of enforcing this law, we said to the court, this is an unenforceable, confusing law, it's unconstitutional, you should overturn it. Also, the idea that, again, that Republicans are perfectly happy with this law and are part of some kind of Democratic conspiracy to keep it in, I think, again, is demonstrably not true. It's very true. Senator McCain is the poster child for this law, but he's almost alone on his side of the political aisle in supporting this law. When the vote came down in 2002, the majority of Democrats voted for this law in the House and Senate. Only a small minority of Republicans voted for it. The majority of Republicans voted against this law because they didn't like it. And almost all of the major lawsuits that have been brought to try to get this law overturned, Republicans have filed them, including 2 pending lawsuits right now, which are going up against the restrictions on the parties, which frankly, if they win the case, will help the independent parties also, because these laws are arguing, for example, about the restrictions placed on the parties for engaging in activity in state elections like the elections going on in Virginia and New Jersey.
My friend, we're in the same district. Lincoln will see that you hear me on these radios. You better know it. You said it in Wyoming. The mayor has the power to do whatever he wants. I don't want to be on that commission for self. I want to be on that commission for the people, the youngsters. Well, you're taking me out, fine. That's your pick, your choice. You made it. All I can say is this. I'll be watching you like a toothpick. I'll be watching every move you make. I believe that the people that was nominated in Waimea for that commission in every district should do their homework and study in their area what it's like the councilman. You represent your council, your area. You bring it to the table. You sit down with your colleagues. You discuss your problem, and you find a solution with 9 people giving their opinions to solve the problem. That's what's supposed to be doing and be done. No, don't worry about what bill you're going to go. Yes, the legislature going to come out. I believe that you should have game management, number one. I believe you got to audit the state goes. Where is our money going for 40-plus years, yeah? Okay, and number 3, yes, we got to get, every time we got to know, sit down with DNLR and have minutes and say, what are you going to do now? They do things while we dance, they fence.
Hold on now, hold on. I think I got, so you're telling me, now I really like what you're saying about the minutes. So what you're starting to say is put a record on, okay, and start tracking what's happening.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, you know what it really boils down to me? It's really even simpler than all this. It's called home rule. It really is, okay? Because that's where it is, and that's why I go back to what I was saying before. If you got a politician who wants to move up the line and is a soldier in the line, okay, in the in the machine, they aren't going to go for home rule, okay? And you see, you're a thorn, bro, because you're an honest man, and there may be a couple others. I hope they sneak in, but this is what they do everywhere. OHA, the whole damn thing, everywhere they can, they make a money-making machine that kicks back money to themselves, okay, and screws the people. That's what it is.
Well, I'll be honest. I mean, I like what you said, and I tell you this, okay?
Yeah.
I worked for the county 34 years, okay?
I didn't ever know that. What were you doing, Pat? What were you doing?
I worked at the Parks and Recreation.
Okay.
My job was to make baseball fields, the diamonds, and all that. And I went to school for that, and I know it like a clock. But anyway, you cannot be smarter than your boss. If you're smarter than your boss, you're down.
Yeah.
But it's not the idea that you're smarter than your boss. Because my personal feeling and my philosophy is very simple. You know things I don't know. I know things that you don't know. Let's put it together for the people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not try to be smarter than anybody else. Because like I said, I know things you don't know, and you know things that I don't know.
And you know what? Sometimes as you evolve, like we're in a moment, we're probably going to get back to guns and let's start going over it. Pat and I have different positions on this, and maybe we're going to learn from each other. Maybe we're going to change each other's mind. Maybe some viewer, submit something. Let us know if we're right, wrong, or whatever here. So, Pat, if we're ready, let's go a couple more things to gun, and let's get into what I think was the main mission today, which is actually talking about our differing views on the assault weapons ban, where we may agree. So here's I'm going to go, this is a story in the Washington Post dated 12/23, 2012. I'm just going to take a couple bits out of this, and again, this is for the people. You can look this up yourself. Okay, now this is History of Gun Control as a Cautionary Tale for Those Seeking Regulations After Connecticut Shooting. Now, one thing nobody could disagree on is that the guns is a very emotional, heated, and divisive issue. It really is, okay? And it's been going on for a long time here, and it's very powerful. You know, there's lots of interest in play here.
Right.
So this one going into here, the ideological chasm was on full display in Washington when the National Rifle Association Executive Vice President, blah, 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 held a Take No Prisoners news conference in which he called for a federal program to put armed guards in every school in the country, saying the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And we're going to go into that in a second, actually, with a libertarian article. He said laws making schools gun-free zones have backfired. They tell every insane killer in America that schools are the safest place to inflict maximum mayhem with minimum risk. LaPierre's remarks were twice interrupted by protesters, one holding a sign, blah, 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 blah. Then we're going to go on to a little bit more of this article towards the end. The broader picture includes a fact that seems paradoxical in Light and Newton. Of course, that's where the shooting was. There's actually less gun violence today than there was 20 years ago. The national homicide rate down is to the level it was in the early 60s. But mass shootings have not declined in tandem with the homicide rate. That's what this one says. But apparently they've stayed the same. Okay? And we're going to go on. And this article also says that, you know, no affluent developed country has anything close to the U.S. level of gun violence, blah, blah, blah. But here's the key thing. When the guns go, the rapes, murders, and other violent crimes, especially against women, go up. So this is a balancing act. I think the guns really have a lot of positive aspects to them, unfortunately. And not to mention, for those of us who are concerned about governments like the Chinese, you know, I hope I can find this, Pat. Have you seen that guy? There was a guy in China. He was a farmer protesting. They were doing the screw job, as they typically do, corrupt, and they were stealing his land from him. Yeah, you know, and the guy stood up and right in front of the tank, you know that, or whatever, the steamroller. And they steamrolled him over.
Right.
They steamrolled the guy right over.
Because this is the way the Chinese believe, and you know what? America is losing our credibility in freedom of speech, freedom of press, and the humanity of the people.
Yep.
Okay, China don't care about that. China, you stand up against them, they'll shoot you.
Yeah, but here's the point.
Disturb their government. Well, America, you're coming like that now.
That's right. And what if a whole bunch of, this is why I'm so thankful about the Second Amendment, because if a whole bunch of those villagers there had guns and rifles, they may not have steamrolled the guy.
Exactly.
You know? Not to mention he could have had one himself. At least the bastard on the machine would have said, hey, you know, maybe I gotta, not run the guy over. I might lose myself.
With all these mastermind scientists and whatever, all these people we have, their PhDs and all that, why don't they put their little heads together, yeah? Their little brain, their so sophisticated brain, put it together and think how we can save the people of America, how we can save the future of our youngsters of America, yeah? Instead of letting it go like this. We may differ in our thoughts and ideas about this mass destruction of guns. I don't, because I don't believe that gun was made to use out in the public. It's military. And once the military has done with it, well, you take America, for example, here we go. America sells our own weapons, our own planes to the foreign countries, and what they do with it? They kill American people.
You know, let's get onto that a little bit. We'll break back to the article in a second. Okay, so Pat has the feeling, and you know, there's no doubt many of these weapons were originally intended for the military, and on simple glance, you would say, well, wow, it's certainly not a hunting rifle, and it's right. But here's what I learned, Pat, as we go along. There's so many more circumstances than we can imagine. There's many people in many differing lifestyles. Now, one thing I just encountered the other day, okay, and this is, again, we're somewhat rural here. I was up in Lower Puna on near Papaya Farms Road, and I was doing a little work, and all of a sudden, pop, 15 rounds, 16 rounds, okay, real fast. What was happening? And it's an organic farm, organic farms and stuff near there. There's tons and tons of pigs. The guy went and popped the pigs. Okay? That's one possible example. Now, not even getting into, just like we were saying about China and the other possibilities of irrelevant governments, how about this? Okay? My old boss, I used to work for a guy, and he was in a very bad part of town because he couldn't afford to have his shop. He was actually a machinist in an expensive part of town, okay? Now, if you saw what happened in the LA riots and other places, I mean, this guy was in a dangerous situation. There are gangs roving around now, especially in the southwestern United States. There are people who have been killed on their own property in the southwest United States, okay, by these gangs. To me, I tell you, man, if I'm a rancher in one of those situations, or if I'm that man in the, you know, bad part of town with gangs roving around, and I've lived in parts of towns where there are gangs and stuff, I sure as hell want a, you know, assault rifle.
It's taken away from the people, but it was given up in the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express.
You try a hide and destroy a freedom. You seek agenda. We know you anti-American. You come forward American Constitution. 1913, corrupt in the system. Devalue dollar, hyperinflation. The Federal Reserve controlled by Lucifer.